At the age of 76, José María Napoleon did not shock the public by naming 6 singers he hated. What unsettled audiences was something far deeper. After more than 5 decades of restraint, silence, and carefully guarded dignity, he finally allowed himself to articulate a truth he had lived with his entire career. This was not a list born of bitterness, rivalry, or resentment. It was a reckoning. A quiet, almost surgical separation between what he believed music should be and what it had gradually become. Napoleon had always been an anomaly in the Latin music industry. While others expanded outward toward stadiums, spectacle, choreography, and carefully constructed personas, he moved inward. His songs were not designed to conquer crowds but to inhabit solitude. He sang as if each verse were a confession whispered to a single listener, never raised to impress, never sharpened to dominate the market. That artistic posture earned him admiration, but it also isolated him. In an industry that rewards amplification, Napoleon chose restraint. And restraint over time becomes resistance. When he finally spoke about the 6 artists he could never truly share a stage with, he was not exposing personal feuds. He was drawing a philosophical boundary. Each name represented, in his eyes, a version of music where form outweighed truth, where technique replaced vulnerability, where image became louder than meaning. To Napoleon, this was not a harmless evolution. It was a betrayal of the very reason he began writing songs in the first place. Music for him was not a product. It was a wound that had to remain open in order to remain honest. What makes his confession striking is its tone. There is no anger in his voice, no desire to settle scores. Instead, there is fatigue. The fatigue of a man who spent decades watching sincerity slowly lose ground to performance. He does not accuse these artists of lacking talent or discipline. On the contrary, he often acknowledges their mastery. His discomfort lies elsewhere. He could not tolerate music that felt rehearsed in its emotion, calculated in its suffering, or polished to the point where nothing human remained visible beneath the surface. This is where Napoleon's story transcends gossip and enters the territory of cultural testimony. His words reveal a larger tension that has shaped popular music for generations. The tension between singing as survival and singing as spectacle. Between the artist who bleeds quietly into the microphone and the artist who commands applause through precision and control. Napoleon never denied the power of the latter. He simply refused to become it. In choosing that path, he paid a price. Fewer appearances. Fewer industry allies. Long stretches of invisibility while others flourished. Yet what he gained was something rarer. The ability to look back without self-betrayal. When Napoleon speaks now, he speaks not as a man seeking validation, but as someone who has already made peace with the consequences of his choices. The 6 names he mentions are not enemies. They are mirrors reflecting everything he chose not to be. What José María Napoleon ultimately exposed in his late confession was not a conflict of personalities, but a fracture in artistic ethics. For decades he stood inside an industry that gradually redefined success as visibility, emotional intensity as volume, and authenticity as something that could be rehearsed. Napoleon watched this transformation from close range. He saw how sincerity was slowly replaced by precision, how pain became a performance tool rather than a lived experience, and how the public learned to applaud the loudest expression instead of the truest one. His refusal to align himself with certain artists was never impulsive. It was cumulative, shaped by years of observation, quiet disappointments, and moments when he realized that sharing a stage would require sharing values he did not recognize as his own. Napoleon's artistic philosophy rested on a simple but demanding premise. A song to be legitimate must cost something internally. It must leave a mark on the singer, not just impress the listener. This belief placed him in constant friction with performers whose control over their voices, images, and narratives seemed almost surgical. He did not deny their discipline. He distrusted their insulation. To him, the more flawless the execution, the more suspicious the absence of risk. Music without risk in his eyes was decoration. Beautiful perhaps, but hollow. The industry, however, does not reward fragility. It rewards reliability, scalability, and repetition. As Napoleon retreated further into an intimate mode of creation, others learned to expand themselves into brands. Tours grew larger, productions more elaborate, personas more polished. Songs were no longer confessions but vehicles. Napoleon did not judge this evolution morally, but he rejected it existentially. He could not exist inside a system that asked him to exaggerate his feelings, to dramatize his wounds, or to stylize his voice for mass consumption. For him, the moment a song began to seek approval, it lost its reason for being. This ideological divide explains why his silences were often louder than his words. When collaborations were proposed, when tributes were organized, when moments of supposed unity were staged for television, Napoleon frequently declined or participated at a distance. These absences were not acts of protest. They were acts of self-preservation. To stand beside artists who embodied a different philosophy of expression felt, to him, like a quiet form of dishonesty. He preferred to step away rather than dilute the meaning of his presence. Over time, this posture shaped how he was perceived. To some, he became difficult, withdrawn, even obsolete. To others, he represented a stubborn reminder of a past where songs were less polished and more dangerous emotionally. Napoleon accepted both interpretations without correction. He never attempted to reframe his narrative. His work spoke for him, and his refusal to adapt became its own statement. The distance between him and the mainstream was not accidental. It was cultivated. When he finally named the artists he could not tolerate artistically, it was not an act of rupture but of closure. He was no longer protecting himself from misunderstanding. He was explaining, calmly and without spectacle, why certain forms of success had always felt incompatible with his inner compass. Each name corresponded to a moment where he felt the industry applauding something he could not feel, something that looked complete but felt empty to him. The discomfort was not jealousy. It was alienation. Napoleon's critique is unsettling precisely because it is difficult to dismiss. He does not attack outcomes. He questions processes. He does not deny popularity. He questions intention. In an era where emotional display is often amplified rather than examined, his insistence on tremor over force, hesitation over certainty, feels almost subversive. He reminds listeners that emotion does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it cracks. Sometimes it fails to resolve cleanly. And those imperfections, he believed, were the evidence of truth. This worldview left him isolated but not empty. Napoleon built a career that prioritized coherence over expansion. He remained loyal to a version of himself that the industry repeatedly tried to reshape. That loyalty came at a cost, but it also granted him something few artists retain: the ability to speak at the end of the journey without regret. His late confession is not an attempt to rewrite history. It is an acknowledgement of it. A declaration that his choices, however limiting they may have seemed, allowed him to remain intact. What gives José María Napoleon's late confession its enduring weight is not the controversy it stirred, but the mirror it holds up to the audience. By the time he spoke openly, the music industry had already completed its transformation. Songs had become experiences, singers had become brands, and emotion had become something to be engineered for maximum impact. Napoleon was fully aware that his words would be interpreted through that lens. Yet he spoke anyway, not to provoke, but to leave behind a record of dissent. In doing so, he positioned himself not as a judge of others, but as a witness to a shift he never accepted. Throughout his career, José María Napoleon occupied an uncomfortable space. He was successful enough to be visible, yet unwilling to play the game that visibility demanded. He understood the mechanics of fame, but refused to submit to them. This contradiction placed him permanently on the margins of the industry's inner circle. He was invited, acknowledged, respected, but rarely embraced. And that distance over time became both his shield and his burden. What Napoleon articulated in naming the artists he could not tolerate artistically was, at its core, a defense of fragility. He believed that music should expose weakness rather than disguise it. In his worldview, the singer is not a conduit of perfection, but a vessel of uncertainty. Each performance ideally should risk failure, should feel as though something might break. That possibility of collapse was, to him, the most honest form of communication between artist and listener. Without it, music became demonstration rather than revelation. This belief placed him in opposition to an era increasingly defined by control. Voices trained to avoid cracks. Performances designed to eliminate unpredictability. Public personas calibrated to project confidence even when singing about pain. Napoleon watched as vulnerability became a posture rather than a condition. He saw artists cry on cue, tremble by design, and suffer within carefully lit frames. To him, this was not expression. It was choreography. Yet Napoleon never framed himself as morally superior. His discomfort was deeply personal. He often spoke of how certain performances made him feel absent rather than moved. Sitting in the audience, he sensed that the singer was present, but the human being was missing. This absence unsettled him more than any technical flaw ever could. A missed note could be forgiven. An emotion that did not originate in lived experience could not. The public, however, had learned to respond differently. Applause grew louder for polish, not hesitation. Emotion that arrived packaged and predictable was easier to consume. Napoleon recognized that this shift was not solely the fault of performers. It was a collective adaptation. Audiences wanted reassurance. The industry supplied it. In that exchange, the rough edges of sincerity were slowly sanded away. Napoleon chose not to participate in that transaction. His refusal was quiet but absolute. As years passed, this choice reshaped his legacy. Younger generations discovered him not through charts or viral moments, but through intimacy. His songs circulated as recommendations rather than campaigns. They were passed from one listener to another like confessions. This mode of transmission reinforced his belief that music did not need mass approval to matter. It needed recognition, not consensus. When he finally spoke openly, many expected bitterness. What they encountered instead was clarity. Napoleon did not describe himself as misunderstood or victimized. He acknowledged that the industry rewarded what it was designed to reward. He simply explained why he could never align himself with those rewards. The artists he named symbolized paths he consciously avoided. Their success did not invalidate his choices, nor did his discomfort diminish theirs. They simply existed on opposite sides of a philosophical divide. This divide, once articulated, becomes difficult to ignore. It forces a reconsideration of how authenticity is defined in popular culture. Is authenticity measured by how convincingly emotion is performed, or by how deeply it is felt? Is a flawless voice inherently more truthful than one that wavers? Napoleon offered no definitive answers, but his life suggested a preference. He chose the path where certainty was replaced by sincerity, even when that path narrowed his audience. In the final analysis, part 3 of this story is about consequence. Napoleon accepted the consequences of his ideals long before he named them publicly. He accepted obscurity over compromise, silence over distortion, and solitude over adaptation. When he finally spoke, he did so not to reclaim relevance, but to explain coherence. His life, his music, and his refusals formed a single uninterrupted line. This is why his words resonate beyond the specifics of the artists he mentioned. They speak to anyone who has felt pressure to smooth themselves into something more acceptable, more efficient, more marketable. Napoleon stands as an example of what it costs to resist that pressure, and what it preserves. He did not emerge victorious in conventional terms, but he emerged intact. That, ultimately, is the legacy he leaves behind. Not a catalogue of grudges, but a record of boundaries. Not a declaration of hatred, but an affirmation of limits. In an industry built on amplification, Napoleon chose restraint. In a culture that celebrates performance, he defended presence. And in a world increasingly uncomfortable with silence, he proved that silence, too, can speak with authority. By the time José María Napoleon articulated his final position, the distance between him and the mainstream had become irreversible. Yet what is often misunderstood is that this distance was never reactive. It was deliberate, cultivated over years of small refusals, quiet withdrawals, and moments where he chose coherence over convenience. In an industry that thrives on adaptation, Napoleon practiced subtraction. He removed gestures that felt false, collaborations that felt ornamental, and opportunities that demanded he translate his inner life into something more digestible. What remained was a body of work that refused to apologize for its inwardness. Napoleon understood something many artists never confront directly. Every career is shaped not only by what one pursues but by what one declines. Each refusal redraws the map. Each boundary narrows the road. He accepted this narrowing with unusual calm. He did not romanticize struggle, nor did he frame himself as a martyr. He simply recognized that the version of success available to him came with conditions he could not accept. To sing louder than he felt. To appear stronger than he was. To turn vulnerability into an aesthetic rather than a risk. Those conditions, once identified, became non-negotiable. This posture inevitably influenced how others approached him. Producers learned that persuasion would not work. Publicists learned that image management would fail. Fellow artists sensed the invisible wall. Napoleon remained courteous, professional, even generous with praise when it was deserved. But he did not blur lines. He believed that blurring was precisely what had eroded meaning in contemporary music. The clearer his boundaries became, the less frequently he was invited to cross them. Yet within that isolation something else took shape. A rare continuity between the man and the work. Napoleon's songs did not evolve toward spectacle. They deepened toward stillness. As years passed, his voice carried less urgency to convince and more patience to reveal. Listeners who encountered him later in life often described a strange intimacy, as if the music were not being performed at them, but shared with them. This was not accidental. It was the result of a lifetime spent resisting dilution. The industry, meanwhile, continued its acceleration. New platforms rewarded immediacy. Emotional impact was measured in seconds, not silences. Artists learned to compress pain into refrains and package vulnerability into repeatable formats. Napoleon observed this from a distance. He did not criticize it publicly, nor did he attempt to intervene. His resistance was passive but firm. He continued to write as if time still moved slowly, as if listeners were still willing to sit with discomfort. That assumption against all odds proved partially correct. What makes his late confession so compelling is that it arrives without urgency. He is not trying to reclaim relevance. He is not correcting a narrative. He is clarifying a position. By naming the artists he could not align with, he was not isolating himself further. He was, in a sense, releasing himself from the need to remain silent for the sake of harmony. The silence had served its purpose. It protected him when speaking would have required compromise. Now speech carried no such cost. There is a quiet courage in that timing. Napoleon waited until the industry no longer had leverage over him. Until approval no longer mattered. Until reputation was fixed, not negotiable. Only then did he allow himself to articulate what had always guided his choices. The honesty of that moment lies not in its content, but in its lack of ambition. He had nothing to gain. That is why it feels credible. At the center of this stance is a redefinition of dignity. For Napoleon, dignity was not about recognition or longevity. It was about internal alignment. The ability to inhabit one's work without contradiction. To sing words that did not require performance to feel real. To accept obscurity if visibility demanded distortion. This definition is increasingly rare in cultural spaces that reward adaptability above all else. Napoleon's refusal to adapt becomes, in this context, an act of preservation. It is important to note that his critique does not condemn popularity. He does not argue that intimacy is superior to reach, or that spectacle is inherently dishonest. What he rejects is substitution. When form replaces substance. When volume replaces meaning. When repetition replaces reflection. His discomfort with certain artists stemmed from the feeling that their work had crossed that threshold. Not because they lacked talent but because their systems no longer allowed space for uncertainty. In that sense, his story is not nostalgic. It does not yearn for a vanished past. It questions a present that has normalized emotional efficiency. Napoleon's insistence on inefficiency, on pauses, on unresolved feelings, challenges a culture that prefers clarity over complexity. He reminds us that art is not obligated to resolve discomfort. Sometimes its purpose is to sustain it. As José María Napoleón looks back, there is no triumph in his tone. There is acceptance. He recognizes that his path limited his exposure but preserved his essence. He recognizes that others chose differently and thrived. These realities coexist without contradiction. What matters to him, ultimately, is not where he stands in the hierarchy of fame, but where he stands with himself. As the dust settled around José María Napoleon's late revelations, a quieter consequence began to emerge. The conversation was no longer centered on the names he mentioned, but on the uncomfortable recognition many listeners felt within themselves. His words lingered because they articulated something rarely admitted in public culture: that the line between authenticity and performance is not abstract, but lived daily by artists and audiences alike. Napoleon did not merely expose his own boundaries. He illuminated the cost of crossing them. Throughout his life, José María Napoleon resisted the temptation to reframe his discomfort as moral superiority. Instead, he framed it as incompatibility. This distinction matters. He never claimed that others were false. He claimed that their way of working demanded a distance from emotion that he could not maintain without losing himself. In a culture that rewards flexibility, such rigidity is often labeled as stubbornness. Napoleon accepted that label without protest. He understood that some identities are preserved not by negotiation, but by refusal. The deeper implication of his stance lies in how it redefines success. Napoleon's career did not follow an upward arc toward mass adoration. It traced a narrower line toward coherence. Each decision he made reinforced the same principle: that an artist's responsibility is not to satisfy expectation, but to remain accountable to the emotional truth from which their work originates. This accountability is invisible to metrics. It does not chart well. It cannot be packaged. Yet for Napoleon it was the only form of achievement that mattered. In the years when his presence diminished from mainstream platforms, something paradoxical occurred. His music gained density. Removed from the pressure to compete, his songs grew quieter, slower, more exposed. Listeners who found him during this period often described the experience as personal rather than entertaining. His voice did not demand attention. It invited it. This mode of engagement contrasted sharply with an industry increasingly dependent on immediacy and spectacle. Napoleon's work asked for patience. It required listeners to meet him halfway. That requirement is perhaps the most radical aspect of his legacy. In refusing to simplify emotion for consumption, he placed responsibility back onto the audience. He did not guide them toward catharsis. He left them inside ambiguity. This choice limited his reach but deepened his impact. Those who stayed did so not because they were impressed, but because they recognized something unresolved in themselves. Napoleon's music did not resolve pain. It acknowledged it. When he finally spoke openly about the artists he could not align with, the reaction revealed a broader cultural discomfort. Many listeners expected conflict, rivalry, or bitterness. What they encountered instead was a man describing his internal compass with surgical precision. His calm unsettled precisely because it resisted polarization. There were no heroes or villains in his narrative, only paths that diverged and never rejoined. This refusal to dramatize difference stood in contrast to an industry that thrives on friction. Napoleon's testimony also reframed the notion of legacy. He did not measure his life's work by accolades or longevity. He measured it by continuity, the ability to trace a line from his earliest compositions to his final reflections without encountering contradiction. This continuity, he believed, was the true inheritance an artist leaves behind. Not influence, not imitation, but coherence. A body of work that does not require explanation to remain credible. In an era where artists are often encouraged to reinvent themselves repeatedly, Napoleon's consistency appears almost defiant. He did not evolve toward trend. He evolved toward clarity. His voice aged, his delivery softened, but his intent remained intact. This constancy allowed him to speak at the end of his career without apology. His words did not seek validation because his life had already answered the questions they raised. What makes Part 5 essential is its shift from individual narrative to collective reflection. Napoleon's story is not only about one man's refusal to adapt. It is about a system that gradually normalizes emotional distance in the name of professionalism. His discomfort exposes a tension that extends beyond music into any field where expression risks becoming performance, where sincerity risks being replaced by technique. His stance invites a broader question. At what point does mastery begin to obscure meaning? Napoleon never claimed to have found a solution. He offered an example. He showed what it looks like to accept limitation in exchange for integrity, to choose a smaller stage if it allows for a truer voice, to remain silent when speaking would require distortion. These choices did not make him immune to regret, but they spared him a deeper form of loss. The loss of alignment between who he was and what he created. As his words continue to circulate, their relevance grows. Not because they expose hidden conflicts, but because they articulate a resistance many feel but rarely express. In a culture that celebrates adaptability, Napoleon reminds us of the value of limits. In a marketplace that rewards visibility, he defends invisibility as a legitimate choice. And in an industry that equates emotion with display, he insists on feeling as an act that does not require witnesses. In the final stretch of José María Napoleon's story, the question is no longer why he distanced himself from certain artists, but what remains after such a distance is sustained for a lifetime. The answer is not isolation, as many might assume, but a rare form of clarity. By refusing to merge his voice with systems that demanded emotional display rather than emotional truth, Napoleon arrived at a position few artists reach. A place where identity is no longer negotiated, only inhabited. For José María Napoleon, age did not soften his convictions. It sharpened them, not into weapons but into definitions. What he articulated in his late confession was the culmination of a life spent paying attention. Attention to what moved him and what did not. Attention to the subtle difference between being heard and being understood. Attention to the moment when a song stops being a necessity and becomes a strategy. He learned to recognize that moment instinctively, and once recognized, he never crossed it. The industry often frames such consistency as a failure to evolve. Napoleon rejected that framing. He believed evolution did not require expansion, only depth. While others adapted by multiplying their presence, he adapted by narrowing his focus. His performances became quieter, his arrangements simpler, his delivery more exposed. This was not retreat. It was concentration. He stripped away everything that felt ornamental until only the core remained. What was left could not be optimized, only felt. This process inevitably reduced his visibility, yet it also refined his audience. Those who continued to listen did so with intention. They were not casual consumers. They were participants. Napoleon's music demanded a certain patience, a willingness to sit with unresolved emotion. In a culture increasingly uncomfortable with ambiguity, this demand acted as a filter. His work did not chase listeners. It waited for them. What distinguishes Napoleon's late reflections from nostalgia is their lack of longing. He does not ask for a return to an earlier era. He does not romanticize a past where music was supposedly purer. He acknowledges that every era has its mechanisms and its compromises. His position is simpler. He chose not to participate in certain mechanisms because they conflicted with his internal rhythm. That choice, repeated over decades, became his identity. There is also a generosity in his stance that is often overlooked. Napoleon never sought to dismantle the success of others. He accepted that their paths resonated with millions. He understood why spectacle appeals, why perfection reassures, why emotional clarity comforts. His refusal was not an accusation. It was a recognition of difference. He could admire craftsmanship without surrendering to it. He could respect discipline without mistaking it for truth. This distinction is crucial to understanding why his words resonate beyond music. Napoleon's story mirrors a broader cultural tension between optimization and presence. In many fields, success now requires constant adaptation, emotional calibration, and performative engagement. Napoleon's life stands as evidence that another approach is possible, one that values continuity over relevance, one that accepts limitation as a form of freedom. As he looks back, there is no triumph in his voice, but there is peace. He does not measure his life against those who achieved greater fame. He measures it against his own capacity to remain honest. That metric, while invisible to charts and awards, governs everything he values. It allows him to speak now without defensiveness, without the need to justify what he did not become. The final lesson of his confession lies not in critique, but in permission. Napoleon gives permission to resist alignment when alignment demands distortion, to choose silence when speech becomes performance, to accept being out of step with the moment in order to remain in step with oneself. These choices are costly. They narrow opportunity. They invite misunderstanding. But they also preserve something fragile and irreplaceable. Napoleon's legacy, then, is not defined by the artists he named, but by the boundaries he maintained. He leaves behind a body of work that does not need reinterpretation to remain valid. It stands as it is, incomplete, vulnerable, unresolved. In a culture obsessed with resolution, that unresolved quality becomes its strength. In the final accounting of José María Napoleon's life and work, there is no dramatic resolution, no moment of public vindication, no late surge of acclaim that reframes everything that came before. What exists instead is something quieter and far more enduring. A sense of internal closure. When José María Napoleon speaks now, he does so from a place where the need to persuade has vanished. His words are not a defense. They are a confirmation. By the time he reached his mid-70s, Napoleon had already lived through every phase an artist could fear. Recognition and neglect. Applause and indifference. Proximity to power and long stretches of irrelevance. None of these experiences altered the axis around which his work revolved. He did not become harder to survive. He became clearer. That clarity is what ultimately allowed him to speak without anger and without nostalgia. He was not settling accounts. He was closing a circle. What remains most striking about his final reflections is the absence of resentment. After a lifetime spent resisting the dominant logic of the industry, he does not express bitterness toward those who embraced it. Instead, he accepts divergence as inevitable. Some voices expand outward. Others deepen inward. Neither path cancels the other. But confusion arises when one is mistaken for the other. Napoleon's discomfort was never with success itself, but with the assumption that success and truth are interchangeable. In this sense, his story becomes less about music and more about authorship of the self. Napoleon authored his own limits. He chose where to stop. In a culture that celebrates boundless growth, choosing limits is often misread as failure. Napoleon understood it as authorship. To define what you will not do is to define who you are. That definition, once lived consistently, becomes unassailable. His late confession functions as a final act of authorship. By naming the artistic paths he could not walk, he clarified the one he did. Not in opposition but in contrast. He did not need to elevate his work by diminishing others. The difference was self-evident. His life had already made the argument. The words merely gave it shape. There is also a subtle generosity in the way he leaves the stage. Napoleon does not instruct younger artists to follow him. He does not frame his choices as prescriptions. He offers them as evidence. Evidence that a life built around coherence may look smaller from the outside, but feel larger from within. Evidence that refusing to optimize oneself does not lead to disappearance, but to a different kind of presence. That presence is what lingers now. In his songs, there is no attempt to resolve pain into triumph. No forced redemption. No promise that endurance leads to reward. What exists instead is permission to remain unfinished. To acknowledge longing without curing it. To sing not because it will be heard, but because it must be said. This permission is rare in a cultural landscape that demands closure. Napoleon's final stance does not ask the listener to admire him. It asks them to listen more carefully, to distinguish between being moved and being impressed, between emotion that is transmitted and emotion that is simulated. He does not claim moral authority. He claims experiential authority. He speaks as someone who has paid the cost of his principles and found the price acceptable. In the end, his legacy is not contained in the controversy of names spoken late in life. It is contained in the decades of names never spoken. The collaborations declined. The stages avoided. The moments where silence replaced participation. Each of those choices reinforced the same alignment. Each preserved the same core. Napoleon exits not as a man misunderstood, but as a man complete. He does not ask to be re-evaluated. He does not seek reconciliation with the industry. He leaves behind something quieter and more difficult to dismiss. A body of work that refuses to explain itself. A voice that never learned to perform pain, only to inhabit it. And a final lesson delivered without spectacle. That lesson is simple and uncompromising. Art does not owe comfort. It owes honesty. Popularity may follow. It may not. Neither outcome determines validity. What determines validity is whether the artist can stand beside their work at the end of their life without feeling estranged from it.
José María Napoleón Can.
And that, more than any list, any confession, or any controversy, is the true conclusion of his story. In the final silence that follows José María Napoleon's words, there is no echo of scandal, only a lingering stillness that asks to be respected. At this stage of his life, José María Napoleon no longer stands inside the conversation of the industry. He stands outside it, observing without urgency, without the need to intervene. What he leaves behind is not a verdict on others, but a closing gesture toward himself. A confirmation that the path he chose, with all its limitations, was enough. What gives this ending its weight is not drama, but restraint. Napoleon does not attempt to transform his life into a lesson with instructions. He does not frame his choices as heroic. He allows them to remain human, marked by doubt, sacrifice, and occasional loneliness, yet also marked by coherence. In a culture that often measures value through expansion, he offers a different metric. Consistency. The ability to live inside one's own voice without fracture. At this point, the names he once mentioned fade into the background. They serve their purpose as symbols, not targets. What remains is the broader question his story leaves behind. What happens when an artist refuses to translate their inner life into spectacle? What happens when silence is chosen over relevance? Napoleon's answer is not theoretical. It is lived. The result is not disappearance, but a quieter form of presence that resists erosion. There is a particular dignity in how he accepts the outcomes of his refusal. He does not claim that integrity leads to happiness, nor that it guarantees peace. He claims something simpler, that it allows sleep, that it permits an artist to look backward without flinching. For Napoleon, that permission mattered more than applause, more than recognition, more than legacy as it is commonly understood. His songs now exist almost independently of time. They are not anchored to trends or eras. They do not age by becoming outdated. They age by deepening. Listeners who encounter them later do not feel as though they are discovering a relic. They feel as though they are entering a private room that has been kept intact. This is the consequence of music that was never designed to impress quickly. It unfolds slowly, revealing itself only to those willing to remain. In this final moment, Napoleon does not ask to be remembered differently. He asks nothing at all. The absence of demand is itself a statement. It reflects a life that never sought to dominate attention, only to honor necessity. He sang because he had to. He stopped speaking when words would have distorted meaning. And he spoke again only when silence was no longer required. The lasting impact of his story lies in its refusal to resolve neatly. There is no triumph over the industry.
No reconciliation.
No late reward. There is only alignment. An ending that matches the beginning. A man who started writing from solitude returns to it, not defeated but complete. The world may continue to reward volume, speed, and certainty. Napoleon leaves behind an alternative that does not compete, simply exists. In the end, his life offers a quiet reassurance to those who feel out of rhythm with their time. That it is possible to remain out of step and still remain whole. That it is possible to choose less and lose nothing essential. That art, when stripped of ambition, can still carry meaning. Sometimes more meaning than ever. This is where the story rests. Not with applause, not with controversy, but with a man who chose truth over amplification and discovered that silence, once honored, can be the most faithful ending of all.